William Browder is Vladimir Putin's #1 foreign enemy, CEO of the Hermitage Capital Management and head of the Global Magnitsky Justice Campaign. Welcome to our program, Sir William Browder.
Great to be here.
Ukraine has fired US-made missiles deep inside Russia for the first time, according to Reuters. 6 ATACMS missiles have hit Russia's ammunition depot in the Bryansk region of Russia. What is your reaction to this, and what does Vladimir Putin feel right now?
My reaction is, of course, a sense of relief that the United States has finally lifted the restriction on Ukrainians using American missiles firing into Russia. It seemed horribly unfair to me that Russia could fire missiles into Ukraine from anywhere and Ukraine couldn't respond. And so, of course, this lifting of the restrictions is a great relief. Having said that, it's coming very late in the process. We're now almost 3 years into the war, and there's been unbelievable damage to Ukraine. And the fact that it's just happening now is very frustrating. And it's also very frustrating because this is the end of the Biden administration. We're now entering into a new era with Trump coming into power, and we don't know what Trump's position on Russia, on Ukraine, and on all different facets of the war will be. And so there's a lot going on and a lot of uncertainty.
Also, Russian dictator Vladimir Putin has changed Russia's nuclear doctrine. So the doctrine says that any attack by non-nuclear power supported by a nuclear power would be considered as a joint attack on Russia. So even a ballistic missile strike on Russia by a non-nuclear state could trigger a nuclear response from the Russian side. What do you make of it, and do you perceive this decision seriously?
Well, so we're now, I think, a day and a half since the ATACMS missiles have hit Russian targets. I'm still sitting here. You're still sitting there. There's no nuclear holocaust. So I think that I think this is what I call nuclear saber rattling. If you remember, Putin has threatened nuclear war on many other occasions based on many other fictitious red lines. I think that we need to just move on. We should ignore his jargon, and we should just carry on fighting for the defense of Ukraine, which means, of course, attacking Russian ammunition depots, Russian military bases, all the places from which they can continue to cause heartbreak, death, and misery for Ukraine.
Do you feel that this Russian nuclear bluff will work at this time? It has been effective for to deter Western leaders previously in the past after the beginning of full-scale invasion, but now, do you feel that this nuclear bluff still works?
Well, I think it always works to a certain extent because nobody wants a nuclear war, and so. But you remember that Putin said if the West supplies F-16s, then there would be a bluff. I mean, a nuclear war. If the West provides tanks, there would be nuclear war. And he even threatened nuclear war if Russian central bank reserves are confiscated. So there's a famous story of the boy who cried wolf, and Putin has threatened nuclear war so many times that it kind of loses its credibility, and also from the Russians' perspective, does he really want to start a nuclear war? I mean, there's a reason why it hasn't happened in the past, and that is what we call mutually assured destruction. I don't think that he wants to destroy himself. We're not starting a nuclear war, and so nor should he. There's also very strong pressure from some of his most sympathetic allies. China doesn't want a nuclear war. India doesn't want a nuclear war. And so I think he's kind of boxed himself in to a certain extent. I think it's stupid for him to make these threats when he doesn't carry them out. And here we are with the ATACMs have already hit Russian soil. There's no nuclear war.
What is your take of current state of Vladimir Putin's position inside the Kremlin in power? What could be his further options, and do you feel that his advisors, his inner circle still believes that Putin would be the best choice for Russia?
Well, he's not giving anybody any choice in Russia. There's no democracy in Russia. And anybody who in any way questions him among the elite finds themselves falling out of apartment buildings, poisoned, murdered in some horrible way. And so, he's running a reign of terror against his own country because he's so scared of losing power, because he understands if he's no longer in power, then he loses all his money, he goes to jail, and he dies. And so he's doing everything he can to stay in power. He's terrorizing his people, and that works, and it's continued to work, and it will work until it doesn't work. And nobody knows at what point it doesn't work. He might be able to live out the entirety of his life in power and stay there for many years, or it could all blow up in his face. You remember Prigozhin marching towards Moscow in June of 2023. These scenarios are hard to predict. We can't predict them. Putin can't predict them. And so it's very hard to know. But what I can say is that he's a mortal human being. He will live he'll live until the end of his natural life, or someone may come to end it sooner. And none of this stuff is predictable.
Do you see this nuclear bluff from Vladimir Putin as a sign of his desperation?
Well, I think that everything is a sign of his desperation. I think that that he intended for this war to be quick and efficient and successful in the first 3 days, and we're now 3 years into it. It's been a total disaster for him. According to Ukrainian military estimates, Russia has lost 725,000 soldiers. There's $300 billion of central bank reserves that are frozen in the West, which I predict will eventually get confiscated. Russia's cut off from the international capital markets. They've cleared out all their prisons for using those people for soldiers who have been killed. The price for a new Russian recruit has gone from $4,000 sign-on bonus to $47,000. It's a messy situation for Putin. It's not going how he planned it. That could all come undone. Hard to say how, but this is a war that I'm sure that if he knew then what he knows now, he wouldn't have launched it. But Putin has no capacity to reverse, no capacity to back down. His only gear is forward, is to escalate, and that's of course terrifying for anybody in Ukraine and terrifying for the West. But there's not going to be a peace treaty that I can imagine. The only treaty that might happen is Putin lying to get a pause in the war so he can regroup and rearm. But I don't see any lasting peace until after Putin is gone.
Reuters today had an interesting publication about possibility of frozen conflict in Ukraine. Reuters sources suggest that Vladimir Putin can agree for a ceasefire in Ukraine in exchange of Ukraine's neutrality and in exchange of even reducing Ukraine's military potential by reducing the size of the Ukrainian army and by imposing other restrictions on Ukraine's military capabilities. Does it mean that Vladimir Putin does not want anything else but only capitulation of Ukraine?
Well, I think that if Putin were to agree to anything, and I highly doubt that there's any deal that could be done that would be satisfactory to Ukraine, satisfactory to the West, and also satisfactory to Putin. The idea that Ukraine gives up its gives up its military capabilities in exchange for a ceasefire is absurd. Ukraine, Ukraine is totally vulnerable to any further attacks by Russia, and why should Ukraine believe a word that Russia says? I mean, look, Russia, the United States, the United Kingdom signed the Budapest Memorandum when Ukraine gave up its nuclear capabilities, and of course, nobody came to Ukraine's defense when Russia invaded. So I think it's a very bad idea to give up any kind of defensive capabilities in Ukraine at any point. And if I were Zelensky, I wouldn't be accepting that.
Let's cover also possible scenarios of Donald Trump's presidency. So if Trump looks bad among Americans by something that Putin does, he could even double down, be tougher on Putin. That what you said on your interview in Times Radio. So could you please give us some insights into your predictions, into your opinion about the possible scenarios of Trump's presidency and his relations with Vladimir Putin? How can he deal with Vladimir Putin?
Well, first and foremost, we should just look at what Trump has said in the last couple of years about this conflict. So Trump has made some crazy allegations that Ukraine is at fault. He's also made a number of very, very strong statements that he wants to cut off military aid for Ukraine. And in fact, he did cut off military aid for Ukraine by proxy with Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, who was able to block military aid from January until the summer. So I think that's the basis for which Ukraine and the rest of the world needs to operate, which is that when Donald Trump comes into power, he's going to cut off military aid for Ukraine. That's the assumption that we should operate on. And if he does that, then it creates a catastrophic situation for Ukraine. As we know, America provides half of the military aid, and without that half, things are going to get very bad very soon. Now, what does Trump get in return for all this? And the answer is he gets some promise from Putin that he's not going to do anything, that they'll draw the line in the sand wherever Putin is. If Putin were to then violate that wherever demarcation is, as you mentioned, it makes Trump look weak. It makes Trump look like a victim. It makes Trump look like he's been betrayed. And we've seen this before. If you remember, the two biggest appeasers of Putin were Germany and France, Scholz and Macron. And at the very beginning of the war, they both traveled, before the war started, they traveled to Putin, to Moscow, and said, "Are you going to invade?" And Putin said in very explicit terms, "No, I'm absolutely not going to invade." And then he did. And so these two countries, which had this long history of appeasement, actually became some of the most stalwart in support of Ukraine. So that's a possible scenario with Trump, assuming that Putin betrays him. But Trump is very unpredictable, both in a way that could be adverse to Ukraine and in a way that could be helpful to Ukraine. So it's hard to predict. But the one thing we can predict is just using Trump's own words to say that he's going to cut off funding.
So if Putin betrays Donald Trump, can Trump go after him? And do you expect there's a possibility of big confrontation between two alphas, as you said in your interview on Times, between two alpha leaders, between Putin and Trump?
Anything is possible, and that's very possible. So Trump doesn't want to look bad. He doesn't want to look weak. At the moment, he thinks of himself as being friends with Putin. That could change, and we've seen Trump go from friend to enemy very quickly, and vice versa. So it's very hard to predict. But the one thing that you have to know is that Trump values how he looks and how people view him more than anything else in the world. And so Putin has to be able to balance out what his objectives are with not making Trump look bad. And that could be very difficult because Putin also has to think about his own political survival, and his own political survival may depend very much on continuing to be aggressive towards Ukraine, and that could put him at odds with Trump if there's an agreement to not do so beforehand.
From your perspective, there are lots of discussions about what does Donald Trump want from Vladimir Putin, Russia and Ukraine, but what does Vladimir Putin want from Donald Trump?
Well, I think very simply, he wants Donald Trump to cut off military aid to Ukraine. That's the main thing. Without that, Russia is in a much better position. He'd also like, if possible, for the United States to lift sanctions on Russia, to allow Russian banks to borrow money, to allow Russian companies to import American goods, to free up the $300 billion of central bank reserves that are held in the West. These are all things that Putin would very much want from Trump. And the question is, if Trump gives him any of these things, does he look weak? And or does he find a way of explaining how he does these things without looking weak? And so it's all up in the air right now. I don't know what's going to happen, but this is a moment of great uncertainty, and I do feel worried. I feel worried for Ukraine. I feel worried for the rest of the world who lives near Russia.
What could happen for Trump's reputation, for his political stance, his position around the globe, if Donald Trump reverses this authorization for Ukraine to strike deep inside Russia with ATACMS missiles, and if Trump also reverses sanctions against the Russian war machine and Russian economy?
Well, if Trump, I can imagine a scenario where Trump says that he wants to avoid World War III, he wants peace, he wants to get rid of unnecessary wars, and therefore the Americans shouldn't support this, and we shouldn't allow ATACMS to be fired into Russia, and he's going to free up sanctions so Russia can be engaged with the world again, and that's going to. And that he's been a strong leader for doing that. That's how he will spin it if he does that. Will people see it that way? It all depends on what happens to Ukraine. If Ukraine ends up in a catastrophic situation, Trump could look very bad. He could also find a way of spinning it and explaining it in other ways. I mean, he's got a great capacity to explain